Lesson 2.5, Video 1, Graphing Linear Inequalities. Now the key here is that we're still graphing lines, which is what this is how they looked before. Different is, though, we are doing inequalities. And by inequalities we mean these symbols. Now if you remember, inequalities have been graphed before, and you typically would say that if it's less than or greater than, you would make a circle, and if it was less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to, you would do a filled in dot. And that's how we would do inequalities in the past. But now we're doing linear inequalities, which means we have to graph something on an XY grid, and it has to follow these same rules. But because it's a line, it looks a little bit different. So if you look at what we have here, we have to, first of all, as before, put them in slope-intercept form, and sometimes that'll already be done. And if we have these symbols, greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to, before we had a solid dot, if you remember right, but now we're going to have solid lines. So they'll look like this or that on your graph, which is what we normally have anyway. However, difference here is that if we have less than or greater than, where before we would have a circle on a number line, now we have dashed lines. So they would look like this. And that tells us that it does not equal the line. And that's the major difference. Okay. Now we also have to consider shading. And when we have a less than in the past, we would have done, for example, this one would have been a circle, arrow going to the left. This one would have been a solid dot, arrow going to the left on a typical inequality. But with linear inequalities, that will have a shade below or just downward. And we'll see what that looks like in a couple examples here. And then if it's these symbols right here, greater than, we would shade above. So before, this one right here would be a circle with an arrow to the right. This one would be a filled in dot, arrow to the right on a number line, but now it's going to be just shading upward. So let's see what that looks like. Here we have an inequality, a linear inequality that's already in slope-intercept form. So we would graph it with our slope and intercept. We have a y-intercept of -3, so that's 1 point. We have a slope of 1/2, rise over run, which means we go up 1/2, and that's our next point. Now the question is, are we going to put a solid line here or a dotted line? And based on this inequality, with that line underneath it, it's less than or equal to, it makes it solid. And our last step is, how do we shade it? So this inequality, since it's less than, says we shade downward. So we're not just graphing the line, we have to decide if it's a solid or dotted line, or dashed, and then where we shade. Okay, let's try our next one. Here we have, again, an inequality already in slope-intercept form. If you look at it, it's like +0, so the y-intercept is 0. The slope is 1, so it's 1/1, so I go up 1/1. We have to decide if I'm going to draw, or we are going to draw a solid line or a dotted line. Well, the inequality has no line underneath it, which means it's not equal to, it's just greater than, so we're going to do a dashed line. And then we have to decide shading, and this is greater than, so greater than says we shade upward, so we shade above the line we drew. So again, graph your line like you normally would in slope-intercept form, Look at the inequality to decide if it's going to be a solid line or a dashed line. And then also look at the inequality to see if you're going to shade above or below. This ends video 1.